Hello again, YouTube world. Thank you for watching. This is Dulu, your British Bangladeshi, reacting to another video. And this time we're going to react to a video about the early history of India, which is very fascinating. As someone from the Indian subcontinent themselves, I was actually born in Bangladesh, but I grew up in England. So it'll be very interesting to watch about the early part of Indian history as well. So we're just going to get started. I'm just going to open up the video and we'll start doing a reaction. Right, so we'll just start the video now and I'll react to this one.
While the transitions between the Copper, Bronze, and Iron Ages in some regions of the world was clear to see, other regions were so large that it was logical to split them up into different periods and ages to truly represent the transition of technology and human development. One such period is the topic of today's video, India's Vedic period, estimated to last between 1500 to 500 BCE.
I'm just going to briefly pause it there. The Vedic period or Vedic period is very, very important into the history. It really set the cultural root and the Hindu aspects of India since then, really, till modern times. Obviously, there were interludes with the Muslim conquest and then, of course, the British, but the fundamental character of India was really established from the reading I've done over the years in this period, and many of it, in fact, much of it continues to this day. So this is a very, very important part of Indian history. So we'll start the video again.
A segment of the transitional period between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age on the huge South Asian subcontinent. This was a very important time for human advancement and civilization, seeing the fall of the Indus Valley Civilization and the subsequent rise of native tribes into early kingdoms and advanced communities. In today's video, we will be exploring several aspects of the Vedic period in detail, examining who lived in India throughout this time, in addition to how they lived, their culture and religion, as well as their use of tools and technology. Join us as we travel back to the ancient world of the Vedic period in India. The Vedic period, which lasted roughly from 1500 to 500 BCE, was a period in India's history which acted as an interlude amidst these ancient peoples' transition between the Bronze and Iron Ages. The period is named for the Vedas, a huge set of religious texts written by the ancient peoples of the time in Vedic Sanskrit. These are the oldest scriptures in relation to Hinduism known today, and contain a treasure trove of information not only on religion, but what life was like in the early days of civilization for the people of India.
I'm just going to pause it there. Sanskrit is a very, very important language, especially for West Asia, South Asia and Europe. It's seen as the root of many languages. Historians and linguists believe there was what they call a Proto-Indo-European language somewhere in sort of Central Asia, maybe in parts of North Iran, eastern parts of Turkey, and from there, they don't know exactly where, but from there, other languages developed what is now called the Indo-European languages. But before the Second World War, they used to be referred to as the Indo-Germanic languages. So that's Sanskrit is a very, very important development and has links to various Asian and European languages.
As such, they are one of the most reliable primary sources for historians and archaeologists to study when learning about this period of time and the people who lived through it. We will cover more on the Vedas later when discussing the religion and culture of the Vedic period. The Vedic period is formed from the ashes of the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's first advanced civilizations, who constructed such architectural feats as Mohenjo-Daro, an archaeological site that shows evidence in great detail of town planning, irrigation, and political structure. The fall of the Indus Valley Civilization, thought to be a result of climate change, displaced a large number of people, some of whom may eventually have settled to the north of the Indus Valley, along with a large number of Indo-European peoples from Western Asia and Eastern Europe. The specific origins of the people of this time is debated, however. It is here, south of the Himalayas and north of the Indus River Valley, that the Vedic period took place. According to the Vedas, these early Vedic peoples followed the ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans and Indo-Iranian religions, eventually forming a unique merge of cultures that would lead to the eventual rise of Hinduism. Before long, however, these people would find themselves.
Just a quick note of that, because obviously they can't go into all the details in such a short video, but the name Iran itself means Aryan or Arya in the original languages of the Aryan peoples who were around sort of the Iran area, Central Asia, and probably the eastern parts of what we now call Turkey, etc. So so that's the historical link really with West Asia and North India. By India, of course, we mean North India, Pakistan, as well as modern day Bangladesh. Because when they're referring to India in these videos, what they really mean is the Indian subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, even bits of Afghanistan, and possibly Nepal as well. So that's something important to bear in mind when we're discussing India in ancient and medieval times.
In conflict. The early conflicts do not denote who the aggressors were, as they were only described as Dasas, which means enemy in ancient Sanskrit. The Rig Veda, the book of Vedas that covers this, describes them as heathens to the Vedic religion, and they're described essentially as barbarians. Later, we are able to see distinct factions warring against one another detailed in the Vedas, such as the Battle of 10 Kings, where the Bharatas, a Vedic tribe, fought and won against a confederation of 10 united aggressors. Territory conflicts are thought to have been the cause of these early battles, as people fought to establish themselves in the region.
Imagine entering your name and a few details, and all of a sudden...
Apologies, we're rudely interrupted there by adverts, so we'll just continue.
From roughly 1000 BCE onwards, we enter the latter half of the Vedic period. By this time, many Vedic tribes had established their territories and had settled firmly into agricultural societies. As they produced crops and commodities, trade became prevalent with the use of horses to transport their produce, and early economies began to thrive in the North Indus Valley. The horses themselves would actually end up becoming a valuable commodity, as animals that were bred for military or religious purposes could not originate from Vedic lands. Trade subsequently resulted in the discovery of new regions and new lands, which meant meeting new peoples and communities. Some of these communities, via trade, would pass down their technological secrets and knowledge to the Vedic tribes, who in turn were able to progress themselves. Through trade, Vedic tribes were able to acquire iron axes that could be used to clear the forests that occupied the floodplains of the Ganges River, as well as plows and farming equipment that could make the most of these fertile new lands. The expansion of territory once more saw much conflict and political union between tribes, some of whom banded together to form alliances and larger kingdoms. It was this behavior that saw the formation of the Vedic period's first official state or civilization, the Kuru kingdom. The Kuru kingdom was born from the union of several large and powerful Vedic tribes, ruled by King Parikshit and his son Janamejaya, who would succeed him. The Kuru kingdom was a religious society governed by hymns, scripture, and ceremonies involving food, drink, fire, and sacrifice. Such sacrifices typically included horses, as seen in the Ashvamedha ritual. Here, Vedic warriors would spend 1 year following a free-roaming horse that was selected by religious leaders. If the horse wandered into a neighboring territory, those people would be made to either pay homage to the Kuru king or prepare to battle him themselves. The Kuru kingdom would eventually face defeat.
That seems like a very convenient way have an excuse to usurp others' lands. It never ceases to amaze me how humanity always comes up with a reason to take somebody else's land. You know, and by taking somebody else's land, we're talking about money. Essentially, it's always about wealth and power. That's quite fascinating. I've never actually heard of that before. So that's very interesting. But again, human ingenuity when it comes to nicking other people's stuff, amazing.
At the hands of the Salva tribe around 900 BCE. This would see the eventual rise of more Vedic kingdoms, including the Panchala of the Ganges and the Videha of Nepal and eastern India. These kingdoms, amongst others, would propel urbanization forward in the Indus River Valley and would occasionally face off in bloody conflicts for supremacy over the Vedic kingdoms.
Sorry, we got interrupted there again, so we'll continue our video. Okay.
The end of the Vedic period in India is typically marked by the introduction of classical Sanskrit to the region, which coincided with the invasion of the region by Darius the Great of Persia. Other regions began to reject Vedic rule and ritual, eventually introducing Jainism and Buddhism to the region in favor of these old ways. With political, militaristic, and religious opposition, Vedic culture could not be sustained and would eventually disappear entirely. As mentioned previously, Vedic religion was dictated by the Veda scriptures that were compiled by Vyasa and passed down orally before the advent of writing. The Vedas were implicated in Vedic societies to teach the peoples of the North Indus Valley about sacrificial practices, how to worship the gods, and how to meditate. It also notes that while the body is temporary and will eventually die, the souls of all beings are eternal and will be reincarnated in another physical form, renewing the cycle of life forever. Vedic religious practices, as well as the aforementioned sacrifices, included ritual chanting and offering objects into a holy fire to reach the gods. Typical prayers from the Vedic period involve asking the gods for rain to water their crops, healthy cattle to raise and eat, and requests for a long and healthy life. The main gods of this religion included the Indra, associated with the sky, rains, and war, and Agni, associated with fire. Other deities within the Vedic religion included Surya of the sun, Vaya of the wind, Prithivi of the earth, and Ushas of the dawn. Some of these deities are present in the Hindu religion to this day. Art, even for religious purposes, was not a particularly important part of the Vedic culture. While the Indus Valley civilization was known to have created the likeness of their gods and goddesses in art, the Vedic tribes and kingdoms favored worship of elements and natural forces via sacrifice rather than depiction, and as such their deities could not be easily depicted in art. Fleetingly painted pottery that appear to show simple, abstract patterns have been discovered from across the Vedic period, but anthropomorphic figures or paintings are hauntingly absent. In terms of social structure, the early Vedic tribes and kingdoms generally lived in a world where class systems were absent, slowly introducing social classes as they moved to the later Vedic period. Tribal chieftains were present in the early period that governed and oversaw communities, but eventually kings would come to rule over the Vedic kingdoms. The kings and their families typically stood at the top of society, along with their Rajanya or nobility. Underneath them stood the Vis, or common people, ordinary citizens who lived within the territories of kingdoms, who might have lived as farmers, metalworkers, or builders. Underneath the Vis were the Dasyu, captured enemies from neighboring tribes or kingdoms who lived as servants to the Vedic society. The Dasyu were typically of different nationalities and ethnicities to those living in the Vedic kingdoms. As time progressed, citizens underneath the king and his immediate associates would enter the Varna hierarchy, which split them up into 4 different castes. At the top, but below the king,
Just very briefly, as I mentioned, I think on another video to reacting to Indian history, unfortunately the caste system does still survive even in modern India, and many things are done to lower caste people that are just simply unjust and I would say immoral. Governments have tried to get rid of it, but it's one of those things that has been around for so long that it's really difficult to get rid of. It reminds me of slavery in other parts of the world, which eventually we got rid of, but it was very difficult to do and it took a long time because it was so ingrained into the economic structure of societies and social structures that it's difficult to get rid of. Whether caste will ever be actually totally got rid of in India is another question altogether. I don't think it will, but there are moves to try and get rid of it, but we'll see what happens in the future, I suppose.
were the Brahmanas, priests who lived in and performed rites at Hindu temples. Below the Brahmanas were the Kshatriyas, who were typically military servicemen and leaders, referred to at the time as warriors. Next was the Vaishyas, who typically provided key services to Vedic society. Everything from farming and animal husbandry to trade and procuring resources for settlements. Underneath them, but still higher than the Dasyu, were the Shudras, citizens who supported or worked under the Vaishyas. The tribes living in the North Indus Valley throughout the course of the Vedic period can be split up further into various archaeological cultures, which help historians and scientists to identify which cultures or tribes made certain artifacts. One of these, and one of the first to be discovered by modern humans, was the ochre-colored pottery culture, belonging to the tribes who once lived in what is now the Badaun and Bijnor district of Uttar Pradesh. As the name suggests, ochre was used to decorate distinctively made pots and containers by these people, who applied the coloring alongside black bands of ink.
Big retailers don't want you to.
Well, we're rudely interrupted again by adverts, so we'll just carry on with the video.
The development of these pots was basic and shoddy in comparison to later cultures, and is thought to have stained the hands of the people working it red once the pot was finished. Other cultures in the wider Vedic area produced more intricate pottery, such as the painted grayware culture and the black and redware culture. Bowls, drinking vessels, cooking pots, and more were developed that range in shape. These vessels were typically decorated using black ink, patterning dots, bars, spirals, and religious symbols into the body of the pottery. Further south was the Gandhara grave culture, identified by their unique funerary practices. Early Gandhara grave cultures buried their dead using pits lined with stone, but later progressed to covering graves with huge cuttings of stone that would mark the location of a deceased person. Some of the people buried in these now exhumed graves were all situated so their bodies were facing either southwest or northeast, with their
So that's very interesting. I hadn't known that Hindu culture or Buddhists in India actually buried people as well. I always assumed that for Hindus in particular, or those under the Hindu culture, would have cremated their dead. I hadn't realised there'd be burials actually. That's quite interesting. Or maybe I did know and I've forgotten, but certainly that's very interesting. I hadn't realised.
their hands resting together. Most skeletons within the graves were buried with pottery, which may have been of great significance throughout a person's life, and the women were often buried with jewelry. There is evidence to suggest that some of these cultures also practiced cremation in death, reducing the bodies of their dead to ashes and perhaps spreading them in a sacred location.
Oh, there you go. That's what I'm familiar with.
In the modern world, it is often difficult for us to obtain information about some of our species' very earliest cultures. This can typically be put down to the fact that many of these cultures lived in a world before the advent of writing, where hunter-gatherer lifestyles were prevalent. Through discovering artifacts such as the Vedas, however, we are able to get an invaluable glimpse at the way writing was utilized in the very first civilizations. With that, we can gain an insight into many things: their culture, their religion, the wars they fought, who their leaders were, and how their societies functioned on a day-to-day basis. There is also much we don't know about the Vedic period, but the Vedas and the artifacts and graves that have been uncovered alongside it can give us a good starting point to determine what it must have been like to live under a Vedic king, or to work the fields alongside a tribal chieftain. With any luck, in the not-too-distant future, archaeologists may be able to discover more about the Vedic cultures and how they lived in the ancient North Indus Valley.
This
There
one
you go.
mistake is stopping
That's
you from
the,
losing weight.
end of
If you
the
want to
video.
drop this, start eating more of these.
So just going to go back and show me again. Yeah, that was very interesting actually. There's some things I didn't know that were in that video, especially about the burial, which I hadn't realised. I always just assumed before the advent of Islam or the British that people were always cremated, but it seems like there were burials as well alongside cremations. I wasn't quite clear on whether that was because of the Buddhists or the Hindus, or there's a difference there. I wasn't quite sure. I'm sure some of you will know better than me. But that was very, very interesting. The early part of Indian, Bangladesh, and Pakistani history. Obviously, they couldn't go into all the details, but as an intro, that was very good. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. So see you again all next time. Bye for now from the British Bangladeshi. Bye bye.